Hi, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I'm joined by Stephen Nemes. That's the way you pronounce his name. It's not Nemes, as I think everyone in the world pretty much wants his last name to be pronounced. We wish his last name was pronounced like Nemes so that it would rhyme with memes, but it doesn't, and that's just unfortunate for the rest of us. And he probably doesn't think that's as funny as it actually is, because he likes his last name in the way that it's correctly pronounced. Anyways, I'm joined by Stephen Nemes and Ben Watkins. If you don't know who either of these guys are, I've had both of them on the channel before. Today we're talking about a new ontological argument. And this is an ontological argument that's been developed by Stephen himself. He's been toying around with it, messing around with this new argument, and he wants to basically try it out on Ben. And so it's going to be a lot of fun today. If you don't know what an ontological argument is, the gist of it is this. It's possible that God exists, so God exists, something like that. And when everyone, like the first time you hear this type of argument, an ontological argument, by the way, when you hear the name of it, you're like, okay, this argument is going to be complex. It does get complex. So if you hear like a quick, pithy version of it, there's probably a whole lot more going on beneath the surface that you're going to have to familiarize yourself with in order to really understand how the argument works, what are some of the main objections to it, and all that kind of stuff. But it's a really, really fascinating argument. And I think atheist Ben probably is going to even admit this as well. This argument, even though he doesn't think it's sound, still a very interesting argument, still thought-provoking, still fun to think about. And so that's why we're doing this debate today. It's just a lot of fun. But thank you guys both for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. All right, so this is what we're going to do, basically, is Stephen is going to lay out his new version of the ontological argument, and then Ben is going to interact with it. The last 30 minutes or so, we're going to try to devote to Q&A. So if you have a question that pops up in your mind during this presentation or during the argument, during the discussion phase, then keep it in your mind unless you want to send it as a super chat. Sending it as a super chat is a lot easier for me to find and pull it up later on in the show. So with that out of the way, let's get on to Stephen. Go ahead and get us to the argument. But before you do that, do a brief introduction of who you are for anyone who might not know.
Sure. My name is Stephen Nemes. I'm a PhD candidate at Fuller Theological Seminary. My dissertation is titled A Constructive Theological Phenomenology of Scripture, and my doctoral supervisors at the school are Drs. Oliver Crisp and Veli-Matti Karkainen. My background is in analytic philosophy, but especially since about 2017 or so, I have really shifted into more of, I've shifted into working more out of a phenomenological perspective. So although I have a background in analytic philosophy, what I'm trying to offer in this particular argument is more of a phenomenological argument of sorts.
And if that term is scaring you, it's going to be explained, right? Phenomenology.
Yeah, so I will explain what I mean by all these things later on. For now, I guess that's a brief introduction.
Probably a good idea to let Ben introduce himself before we get into the meat of it. So Ben, let everyone know who you are.
Okay, so my name's Ben Watkins, and I'm the host of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from an atheist perspective. Stephen and I have become friends over the past year or so, and I'm really interested in his continental/analytic background. So for those who do know me, my training is also in analytic philosophy, but my thought has taken somewhat of a Hegelian/continental turn over the past couple years. So we've been meaning to do this for a while. I've also been criticized very heavily for my attitude towards ontological arguments in general. And so this is, I think, a fresh perspective on what might be considered kind of a worn-out argument. So I was really excited when I heard that Stephen had put this together, and so I'm hoping that we can have a lot of fun today just bouncing ideas off each other and seeing what all can come from it.
Great. All right. Well, like I said, we're going to do a presentation of the argument first, and I've got some slides prepared to show on the screen so we can all follow along as best as we can. And then toward the end of it, we're also going to be discussing all of the objections that Ben will bring. We also have some prepared objections that Stephen is ready to address or talk about. So there's a lot to do today. A lot to talk about, so you definitely want to stick around for the whole thing. All right, Stephen, let's go ahead and get started. Should I pull up the screen, or did you want to say something else first?
Not just yet. I'll
Okay.
let you know when.
Great.
So basically what I want to do today is to present what I think is a new version of the ontological argument. I think that it's new because it's not exactly the sort of argument that has been considered in academic treatments of the ontological argument. For example, it's not quite like Alvin Plantinga's modal argument. It's not quite like Anselm's argument or Descartes' argument. You won't find the discussion of something like this in Graham Oppy's books about the ontological argument. So I think that it's new, and I call it I have a sort of a long and cute name for it. I call it a quasi-Thomistic ontological argument with a phenomenological twist. I call it quasi-Thomistic because I'm arguing for the existence of God understood as pure actuality. So the notion of God that we're talking about here is not the notion of a maximally perfect being or a being who is omnipotent, and omniscient and morally perfect and personal, or else a community of persons that have these qualities. I'm not talking about anything like that. I am talking about pure actuality, actus purus in Thomas Aquinas' Latin. So that's the conception of God that I'm working with in this argument. That's why it's quasi-Thomistic. Now, Thomas Aquinas had objections to the ontological argument. He, from what we can tell, he did not think that the ontological argument succeeded, or at least the argument of Anselm. So that's why I call it quasi-Thomistic, because I realize that there are Thomistic objections to the ontological argument. I call it quasi-Thomistic because the conception of God that I'm working with is the Thomistic conception of God as pure actuality. Right? That's why it's quasi-Thomistic. It's an ontological argument because it attempts to show that God exists by supposing that denying that God exists entails a contradiction. So it's an ontological argument because it shows that God exists on the basis of the fact that the non-existence of God would entail a contradiction. So that's why I call it an ontological argument. Perhaps it's not a pure ontological argument in the sense that it doesn't move from the possibility of God to his actuality, like Cameron suggested at the beginning of the presentation. But I say that it's an ontological argument, or perhaps something like an ontological argument, because again, it deals with the existence of God, and it tries to prove the existence of God on the basis of the fact that the non-existence of God would entail a contradiction. And I say that this argument comes with a phenomenological twist because the argument has one critical presupposition, which is namely a specific interpretation of the notion of intentionality in Edmund Husserl. And I'll talk more about this when we get to the presuppositions of the argument. But that's basically what I call it. I call it a quasi-Thomistic ontological argument with a phenomenological twist. Now, as I mentioned, this argument has two critical presuppositions. So if you'd like, Cameron, you can show the first slide.
How about instead of doing that right now, why don't we get Ben to ask any questions or get any clarification, okay, or if he wants to say anything about the two things that you said there.
Sure.
I think you're muted, Ben.
How about now?
There we go. Yep.
There you go.
Okay. So I'm not going to try to object, I guess, at this point, but maybe just some points of clarification. So sure. I see this ontological argument as being different than Anselm's, Descartes, and Plantinga's. So they all three give variations of their own form of ontological argument. But to me, this sounds more like a presuppositionalist argument. It seems like we are starting with some datum, and then suggesting that this datum implies the existence of God, or because it presupposes it in some way. Mm-hmm. Now, my understanding of ontological arguments, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, is that they are demonstrations from the very concept of God, such that they are a priori and analytical claims. So they are not substantive claims. They are trivial claims about the concept of God that imply its very own existence. This doesn't seem to be that it doesn't have that analytic characteristic of traditional ontological arguments. Is that right? Would it?
Well, no. So I would say two things. I don't think that this argument is presuppositionalist because it's not an attempt at a transcendental argument. I'm not trying to show that the existence of God is the transcendental condition of an intelligible world or anything like that. I do agree with an argument like that. Like, obviously, I agree because I believe that God exists. I believe that he is the condition of the existence of an intelligible world. But that's not what I'm trying to show with this argument. So I wouldn't call it presuppositionalist from that point. I think presuppositionalist arguments are transcendental, and that's not what I'm trying to do. So you say that ontological arguments try to move from the concept of God and sort of like just analytically true definitions about the concept of God to the actual existence of God. I don't think that I'm trying to do quite that, because I am also, as will become clear when I try to elaborate the second presupposition of this argument, which has to do with the notion of intentionality and a specific interpretation of the intentionality of consciousness. I don't believe in these things called concepts, right? I don't believe in these things called concepts or notions or ideas which somehow mediate between consciousness and the world. So I'm not trying to argue from the concept of God to the reality of God, because I don't believe in concepts. I believe that, as I will make clearer later, the intentionality of consciousness is direct, so that I don't need a mediating item like a concept or a representation in order to be intentionally related to some object. So that would be a way in which I distinguish myself from Anselm or Descartes or these guys. I sort of reject this idea about concepts that play a mediating role between consciousness and the world.
I think at this point it'd be good to move on to the actual argument. Aside from the fact of how we're going to categorize this argument, I think it's still an interesting argument, and it deserves
Sure.
discussion.
I just have one more question, just so that we're clear on the concept of God that's in play here. So, because this is a Thomist conception of God, or at least a quasi-Thomist conception of God, we're not starting with the concept of a being that's wholly worthy of our worship. And I think you were hinting at this earlier when you're saying that your concept of God doesn't include divine attributes like omnipotence or perfect goodness or omniscience, stuff like that. We're starting with the concept of purus actus. We have the right concept of God in play here. We're not using the personalist conception or a perfect being conception. We're using this Thomist conception.
Correct. Yeah. So in my mind, God is pure actuality, pure, subsistent being, if you want to use that term also. It's the same thing. I would say this. I don't think that so I think that you can interpret these notions of omnipotence and so on in such a way that they can be said of pure actuality, but I'm not starting from this, presumably shared notion of omnipotence and then putting together a bunch of, properties into this concept and saying this is what I'm talking about, right? So I'm not doing that. I'm saying let's start with this understanding of God as pure actuality, and I'm trying to show in this argument that pure actuality is actual, right, and necessarily so.
Awesome. I think now's the perfect time then to go into the argument.
Sure.
I think we got all the concepts clear enough.
All right, let me go ahead and pull up the slides that we have prepared here. So we have 3 different slides, and just let me know when you're ready to switch between them.
Sure. So, like I said, my argument has 2 presuppositions. I cannot, I'm hoping that I won't have to defend these particular presuppositions in much detail because they're difficult things to defend, and they're not uncontroversial among philosophers. But I guess what I'm trying to do in this argument is to show that, okay, here's one way of coming up with a valid ontological argument that, perhaps you might find convincing. I'm not personally committed to this argument, but at the same time, I'm not neutral about it either. I find it more and more convincing the more I think about it, but I'm not yet ready to say that I will defend this argument with my life or anything like that. So the first presupposition of my argument is this: contradiction is a sufficient condition for impossibility. Now, what I mean by that is that a contradictory object or a contradictory state of affairs is for that reason also impossible. So I'll give an example. It's, a red circle is a possible object, whereas a square circle is not a possible object. A square circle is an impossible object. And the difference between a red circle and a square circle is that the square circle is contradictory. It's this concept or this idea of a square circle, this object, includes properties which are at contradiction with one another. For example, because it's a circle, it only has one side, and because it's a square, it has exactly 4 sides. And of course, one thing cannot have both exactly one side and exactly four sides. That's a contradiction. So it's the contradictory essence of a square circle that makes it to be impossible. And my suggestion is that anything that is contradictory is for that reason also impossible. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about particular objects like a square circle or perhaps a state of affairs which includes multiple objects. This is also an impossibility. Peter's being simultaneously shorter and taller than Paul in exactly the same respect and at exactly the same time. Right? That's not a single object. It's a state of affairs that includes a relation between two objects, namely Peter and Paul. But because it's contradictory, that state of affairs is also impossible. So not only particular objects like the square circle are impossible, but also state of affairs which include contradictions. Those are also impossible. So that's the first presupposition of my argument. A contradiction is a sufficient condition for impossibility. The second presupposition of my argument is this. The intentionality of consciousness means that thought is in immediate contact with its object. Now, this may take a little explaining, so I will try to make it a little clearer. One of the fundamental insights of phenomenology as a school of philosophy is the notion that consciousness is intentional. Now, Heidegger defines intentionality as directing itself toward. Consciousness, according to phenomenology, is directed toward objects. That means that every conscious experience is of or about something. So, for example, if I am conscious of my cat, for example, I see my cat on the couch opposite me in this room. That is an act of consciousness, and it has an object. It's not simply this bare thing. The act of consciousness has a certain direction, namely, it's a perception of my cat. The cat is the object of my consciousness, and my perceiving is directed in some way at my cat. And this is true for more or less, for very many forms of consciousness. I mean, there are some philosophers who think that there are non-intentional forms of consciousness, but we can leave that to the side for the moment. For the most part, consciousness is intentional, which is to say that it's directed at objects. And Husserl also analyzes the structure of the conscious act as consisting of these two components. On the one hand, there is the mode of intending, which is what he calls the noesis, but I'll just call it a mode of intending to keep things in English. And then there's also the intended object, right? The intentional object. So let's take the example of my perception of the cat. The mode of intending is perceiving. That's the specific mode of consciousness that I am undergoing right now. I am perceiving the cat. So the mode of intending is the perceiving, and the intended object is the cat. But there are lots of different ways that I can intend the same object. For example, I can see my cat, which is a form of visual perception. I can think about my cat, which is a different form of intending. Right? It's not the same thing to see a thing and to think about it. I can remember my cat, which is another form of intending. I can anticipate purchasing a cat, which is another form of intending. I can judge that my cat is misbehaving. I can appreciate my cat. I can love my cat. I can hate my cat. So you can have different modes of intending, right? All of these, loving, hating, appreciating, judging, etc. These are all different modes of intending, which are directed at the same object, namely my cat. It seems Ben has disappeared.
Yeah, I think his video went away for a second. It looks like he's still in the chat, so I think we'll keep going. I think he's still here.
Okay, that's fine.
So I'm sorry, I accidentally unplugged my webcam with my foot. So I was hoping to plug it back in without anyone noticing, and of course Cameron noticed.
That's all right. Okay, so consciousness has this dual structure. There's the mode of intending, and then there's the intended object. Now, there is a controversy among phenomenologists about how to understand the intended object. There's two schools of thought. There's what's called the West Coast School and the East Coast School. The West Coast School says that the intended object is not the real world object, but some sort of like a mental representation, kind of like the sense in Frege, right? The Fregean notion of a sense is this mediating object between language and the world. So I can refer to things in virtue of the fact that my language expresses a sense, and that sense itself is somehow like points at, an object. So that's one interpretation of the intended object in Husserl.
Is that I'm sorry to interrupt, the force content distinction in Frege? I haven't read Frege in a while, so I'm trying to remember. There's the force, the attitude towards the content of a proposition. Is that this model?
So I don't know. I'm not an expert in Frege. Also, I simply know that this interpretation of Husserl is sort of akin to this Fregean notion of a sense.
Sure.
Right. So Frege distinguishes between sense and reference. Sense is like this abstract thing that is expressed by a proposition, and the referent of the sense is like some real world object which may or may not exist. Right. Gotcha. So we can talk about Santa Claus because even though Santa Claus doesn't exist, there is the sense of Santa Claus, this abstract object that can be expressed.
Even though there's no referent for that sense to refer to. Gotcha.
Now, some people.
Sorry, continue.
No, that's fine. Yeah. So some people interpret the intended object in Husserl the same way. They say that the intended object is not, strictly speaking, the real world object. It's this kind of Fregean, sense-like thing, this sort of mediating thing, a representation of some kind, which may or may not, have an actual referent, which may or may not correspond to something that actually exists. So that's one interpretation of Husserl. The alternative interpretation of Husserl says, the East Coast interpretation, says that there is no mediating object between the intending mode of consciousness and the real world object. The consciousness is simply directly intentional. There is no need of some mediating, tertium quid, some third thing between consciousness and the world in order for consciousness to be intentional. So, for example, according to this second interpretation of the intended object in Husserl, when I perceive my cat on the couch, the object of my perception is not a representation of my cat. It's not a representation. It's not an idea. It's not a sense. It's my cat. So this is what I mean when I say, for example, in the second presupposition of the argument, that thought is in immediate contact with its object. What I mean to say is that I deny this notion of a mediating thing between intending consciousness and the real world. All right? Thought is just an immediate contact. There is no need of something in between thought and object for thought to be intentional, for thought to be in some kind of a contact with its object. Now, this is controversial. I'm willing to admit that this is controversial. One of the arguments that people typically give against this view is, it goes like this. Okay, well, how is it that we can have intentional states where the intentional object doesn't exist, right? Suppose I'm hallucinating something. Martin Heidegger gives the example of a hallucination of an automobile, right? Suppose he's lecturing in the lecture hall and he hallucinates an automobile. How is it that state of consciousness can have an object if there is no automobile, in fact? Right? This would be an argument for saying, well, that's because the immediate object of the consciousness is not the supposed automobile; it's a representation of an automobile. But I think that this argument is a failure. I don't think that we need to propose these sort of mediating items for the following reason. My hallucination of an automobile is not a hallucination of nothing, right? It's not as if I'm not hallucinating anything. I'm hallucinating an automobile. So there is a given object. The falseness of this hallucination, the falseness of this experience does not consist in the fact that the automobile doesn't exist, because the automobile is not nothing. The falseness consists in the fact that I see this automobile and I take it to be actual when in fact it's not. In fact, it's just a projection of my imagination or whatever it is, So I think that this East Coast interpretation of Husserl can solve this problem by saying that everything, every consciousness is intentional, but we can be mistaken about the mode of being of the objects of our consciousness. I hallucinate an automobile. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say it might be good for us to move on if we can. We're about 30 minutes in and we haven't gotten to the argument. Do you think that, Ben, would you like to say anything about the two presuppositions, or would you like to hear the argument first and then start to interact? Because two of the premises in the argument are the presuppositions.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and concede the first one because I think we both agree that contradictions are necessarily false, and that's a necessary truth. So I don't think we're going to have a ton of disagreement there. But I think we'll have a ton of interesting disagreement about two, because I come from a school of German idealism. So Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. These are all thinkers who do argue that we mediate the world by our senses using concepts. So I'll go ahead and let Stephen give the argument now, but I think that there's definitely going to be an interesting dialectic of Kantian versus Husserl.
Yeah,
right,
well,
yeah, go
let's
ahead,
see how it goes. Okay, so let's see the argument. All right, so those are the presuppositions of the argument. More could be said, but we'll leave that to the side for now. Here's the first premise of the argument. It is not consistently thinkable that pure actuality is not actual. The second premise, therefore it is not possible that pure actuality is not actual. Therefore it's necessary that pure actuality is not, pure actuality is actual. That's a typo. Therefore pure actuality is actual. So the third premise should say, therefore it is necessary that pure actuality is actual, right? Because it's not possible that it's not actual. So therefore necessarily it is actual. Therefore it's actual. Pure actuality is actual. So let me try to justify the argument like this. The first premise says this: it is not consistently thinkable. In other words, it's contradictory to say or to think that pure actuality is not actual. That's because actuality is that in virtue of which we say that a thing, or we rightly say that a thing is actual. So for example, I am actual and Ben is actual. That is because I have actuality and Ben has actuality. So that's why it's appropriate and it's true for us to say that Stephen is actual, Ben is actual. Now, I do not have actuality by definition. I can go out of existence, and there was a time when I didn't exist. And so also with Ben. So it's not a contradiction, even though it might be contingently false. It's not a contradiction to say that Ben is not actual or that Stephen is not actual. However, actuality is constitutive of pure actuality, right? Pure actuality is just constituted by actuality by definition. That's why it is not consistently thinkable to say that pure actuality is not actual. Now, why do I mention the second presupposition here? Because I do not think that this premise can be restated in the following form. The concept of pure actuality has no instances. That's a statement about a concept, whereas my first premise includes a statement that's about pure actuality. Remember the second presupposition, right? My consciousness is directly in contact with its object. I don't need a mediating concept in order to refer to things. When I talk about pure actuality, just as when I talk about Ben or when I talk about myself, I'm talking about pure actuality and not a concept. Just as when I talk about Ben, I'm talking about Ben and not about the concept of Ben or an idea or a representation of Ben or anything like that, right? So the first premise involves the second presupposition of the argument, namely this East Coast interpretation of intentionality in Husserl. Okay, so because it's contradictory to say that pure actuality is not actual, for that reason, by way of the first presupposition, it's not possible that pure actuality is not actual, right? The contradictory nature of this proposal, pure actuality is not actual, the contradiction of that makes it impossible for it to be true. Therefore, it's not possible, right, that pure actuality is not actual. And of course, if something is not possible, then its negation is necessary, right? So if P is not possible, then not P is necessarily the case. That's why the premise 3 follows. And if something is necessarily the case, then it's actually the case. And that's why the conclusion at the end follows from number 3. So the argument is very simple, right? There's basically like one premise and then 3 inferences on the basis of that premise. And that premise is really where the rubber meets the road. It's that premise interpreted in light of the second presupposition of the argument, namely this interpretation of the direct intentionality of consciousness. So that's the argument in a nutshell.
All right, let's move to Ben. I'm just going to pass it directly over to Ben and start to get your thoughts.
Okay.
Should I pull up the argument again? Would you like to look at the
sure.
structure of it?
No, I think,
okay.
That'll both be good for me and for the audience, I feel sure.
Yeah, so one of the things he said was that 2, 3, and 4 follow sort of, you didn't say deductively, but there are reasonable inferences from 1. So 1 is really the only contentious premise.
Well, yeah, and so he
agree with
mentioned
that, Ben?
So he mentioned the earlier presupposition that contradictions were a sufficient condition for impossibility. And so I think by already having conceded that premise, the 3 other premises follow, the inferences that follow from that main first premise follow. because I think that's all that's being worked out there. Where really the disagreement is going to come in is with that first premise. And so we said at the beginning that this, so I'll start with a softball, I guess, is that this argument is much different than Plantinga or Descartes or Anselm. So the standard objection so there's two standing objections to these sorts of ontological arguments. There's the first one comes from a contemporary of Anselm, a monk named Gaunilo, who came up with the parity arguments of the ontological argument, which basically try to establish something like the greatest possible island or the greatest possible pizza or something. Basically the objection is that this form of argument can be used to drive contradictions, and because like we admitted, contradictions can't be true, there must be something wrong with the argument. And then the second objection comes from Kant, again, that existence is not a real predicate. It's not a property that things have in the world. Now, this argument supposedly avoids both those standing criticisms. So I think the best place to start in a defense of this argument would be to explain just how this argument avoids those two standing criticisms of traditional ontological arguments.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start the discussion, and I'm happy to do so. I'll begin with the parity objection, because this is the one that I put the most work into, and this is my opinion. You can correct me if I'm mistaken, or if you come to the conviction at the end of this that I'm mistaken. But I think that this version of the ontological argument, which tries to prove God as pure actuality, manages to avoid the parity objection for the following reason. Let's take, for example, a necessarily existent cat. Okay, I think there is no such thing, a necessarily existent cat. Let's say, or an actual cat, the supposedly actual cat. It is not, consistently thinkable to say that the actual cat is not actual. Therefore, necessarily the case, the cat is actual. The actual cat is actual. I think there's a difference between these two things. I think there's a difference between pure actuality and what I will call a this such. And I know this language can be confusing because it's not like the way analytic philosophers typically talk, but I think that this such really is the best form of language to speak about something. A this such is an individual being of a certain nature, right? So a this such is a composite of two principles, namely thisness and suchness. If we do an analysis of any object whatsoever, for example, this glass, right? This glass is an individual being of a certain nature, which is to say that it has thisness. It has a principle of individuation, in virtue of which it's a particular, and it also has suchness. Now, the suchness of the glass is its intelligible content. It's those properties and qualities, etc., that make up the glass and that can be known about it. For example, this glass, has a certain shape, a certain size, a certain weight and density, a certain color, a certain capacity to refract and reflect light, and so on. These are all qualities that belong to the glass, that are, sort of constitutive of the glass, and that together form the suchness of the glass. Now, some of those qualities are going to be here essentially, some of those are going to be here accidentally. So you can make distinctions within the suchness of a thing between what's essential and what is accidental. But what's essential and what are accidental alike are part of the suchness. It's a part of what the thing is, right? What you can know about it, what you can grasp. The thisness of this cup, its particularity, right? It's what makes the difference between cupness, or the nature of cup in general, and this cup, right? It's what makes the difference between a glass in general and a particular glass object, the thisness. Now, my suggestion is that every this such, well, I'll say it like this. I will say actuality is not constitutive of the this such. Anything that is a this such, is not actual. It does not have actuality as a constituent part of it. And this is, in fact, Kant's criticism, right? Kant says that every existential proposition is a synthetic proposition. That's because existence, the predicate, is not a part of the subject concept, right? So if I say that the cup exists, that's a synthetic judgment because existence is not a part of the concept of the cup. If we were to put it in more of my language, I would say that actuality is not constitutive of the this such. The actuality of this cup is something outside of this cup qua this such. It's something that's not a part of its suchness. It's not a part of its thisness. It's something else that's added to that. And I say that that's true for every this such, whether we're talking about a cup or a cat or an individual human being or a maximally great island or whatever. Anything that is a this such is not going to be constituted by actuality. So that means that when we talk about the actual island or the actual cup or the actual cat, what we're doing is we're taking that this such and we're adding something to it in a synthetic judgment. We're saying this cat, which is actual. It's not, the cat by itself is not actual. The actuality is something added to it through a synthetic judgment. So when we say, for example, that the actual cat is not actual, basically what we're doing is affirming a contradictory conjunction. This cat is both actual and not actual. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the this such by itself is not actual. When I talk about an actual this such, I'm saying this such, which is actual, is also not actual. Now, of course, that conjunction is impossible, right? Something cannot be and not be at the same time. But of course, the impossibility of a conjunction is consistent with the truth of just one of the conjuncts. So, for example, let's talk about the actual Golden Mountain. It's true. The actual Golden Mountain is not actual. That's an impossible thought. But it doesn't follow from that the Golden Mountain is actual because the Golden Mountain considered in itself does not include actuality. So it's consistent with the impossibility of the conjunction that only one of the conjuncts is true, namely the one which affirms of the Golden Mountain that it's not actual. So this is why the parity objection doesn't get off, because pure actuality is not a this such. And I can try to prove it like this. Any this such is a unity of these two components, suchness and thisness. Now, these two principles stand in potentiality relative to one another. Thisness is just individuation. It can individuate anything. I am a this, you're a this, my cat is a this, the sofa is a this. Every individual object is a this, right? So thisness is present in every individual object. And thisness, for that reason, is also indifferent to the suchness that it individuates. There are individual cats, there are individual dogs, there are individual humans, there are individual trees. So individuality per se is indifferent to the nature of the thing that is an individual. So on the other hand, suchness also is indifferent to the matter of its individuation. Suchness is general, right? Humanity, for example, is general. Considered in itself, humanity is general. That means that it's not essentially tied to any particular being. Humanity is not essentially tied to me. Humanity can go on existing while I cease to exist, while you cease to exist, while Cameron ceases to exist. So also with felinity. Felinity is not connected to any particular cats. Felinity in itself is just a general possibility of being. And it's indifferent to the existence of any particular this such. Now that means that the unity of a this such, individuated humanity, individuated felinity, individuated, dog nature, whatever, is an actualization of a potentiality for unity that exists in the this and in the thisness and the suchness. So the unity of these two principles is an actualized potential. And so therefore no this such is pure actuality. And for that reason, no pure actuality is not a this such. Pure actuality is constituted by actuality. It's not a unity of these two principles. It's not like an individual being that has the property of being purely actual. That's not what God is, according to this pure act theism, as I call it. So the way that I would respond to the parity objection is like this. The parity objection fails because these parities are inevitably instances of this suches. Of course, no this such is actual by definition. Actuality is not constitutive of any this such. And so that means that when we talk about the actual Golden Mountain or the actual perfect island or the actual, maximally great slice of pizza or whatever, we're saying this such, which is actual, is also not actual. So we're making a conjunctive predication of the same object. And of course, the two predicates contradict each other, so they can't both apply. But that's consistent with only one of them applying. And it's also a synthetic judgment because actuality does not enter into the definition of any this such. However, actuality does enter into the definition of pure actuality. Therefore, pure actuality, you cannot say that it's not actual, right? It is actual by definition, and so therefore it's actual. So that's how I would respond to the parity objection. Now, I realize we have to talk about Kant also. I kind of mentioned Kant a little bit there, but I think I'll hand it over to Ben and see what he says about this response.
Well, so I was going to let those responses stand because we had already agreed that your argument is not like these other arguments. So the objections that I'm putting forward just don't even apply to your argument. So it's going to be tough for me to respond. It's going to be tough for me to respond to that.
Right, because you've already agreed with me.
Yeah. So I would like to go ahead then and lay out some of the Kant that I understand.
Sure.
Would be a good time because then you can do the existence is not a predicate objection, and then I can move into Hegel after that. I think that would be a good way to let it unfold. So my understanding of Kant and the way that Kant has influenced my thought is that it's necessary that we mediate the world through concepts. So why is this? Why do we have to have concepts? So Stephen would deny the existence of concepts, where I would insist that they are the rational structure of the world, such that, and to use the Kant, he makes a famous distinction between appearance and reality, or what he calls it, the phenomena and the noumena. Mm-hmm. And so this is the way so the phenomena is how the world impresses itself on our senses, whereas the noumena is the world in itself. And so how can we have knowledge of this world in itself? And so Kant starts off by noticing that by just even dividing the world up into appearance and reality, or into subject and object, already presupposes that there is a subject of experience and an object of experience. And so this is the self-consciousness of thought. Thought is self-conscious. So we have to understand, if we are to make sense of the world, if we are to distinguish ourselves from other non-rational atoms, it's because we can divide the world up like this and have a concept of a self, an experiencer, a knower, an individual that can then understand the world in itself by mediating through concepts. So now that's one way in which I would want to insist that concepts are real. Kant, and you probably explained this better than I could have in your example with Kant earlier, of how existence is not a predicate, in that when we make existential claims or claims about something existing, something having being in the world, that's existence is not a predicate. It's not part of the predicate concept. The subject concept. So you have the subject concept and you have the predicate concept, and existence not being part of the predicate concept means that we've added it to it. That's what makes it a synthetic judgment. So this requires that existence is not a real predicate. It's something that things do or substances do in order to have properties at all. And so since existence isn't a predicate, this undercuts Anselm's argument in particular, because Anselm wants to say that existence is a perfection, that it is a predicate. And so if it's not a predicate, that argument just doesn't work. So you've dedicated a lot of time to the parity objection, but how would you approach this Kantian objection?
Yeah, so I think that I agree with it. I agree that existence is not a predicate. In this sense, existence is not a part of the content of a thing, right? When you think about like for example, like this cup. What is the content of this cup? Well, it's made of glass. It's hollow in the middle. It has a certain weight. The glass is transparent rather than being merely like translucent or whatever else. Like you can see through it. It has a temperature at the current moment, and so on. So these are all parts of like what I call the content of the this such, right? Or like what goes into the predicate, what goes into the concept of the thing in Kantian language. I agree with Kant that existence is not one of the properties of this thing. Existence is not a part of the content of this thing. And we could even give a phenomenological proof of this, right? I can study this glass. I can look at it from 100 different angles. I can put it in different situations, and I can discover all kinds of properties that it has. But never in that whole series will I ever discover that it exists. I'll discover that it's, this property, that property, and so on. But there's always going to be a question: does this actually exist? Right? This is the point that Husserl makes. No object of transcendent perception is guaranteed to exist. Every individual thing that I perceive, like with my eyes, for example, might not actually exist. But that doesn't mean that it's not that I'm not perceiving anything. I mean, I'm perceiving the content. I'm perceiving the this such. This glass, which has a certain shape and qualities and so on, that's an individual and so on and so forth. But the existence is something else. It's not one of the properties of this thing. It's something else that this glass perhaps possesses and has in some way. So I agree with Kant. Existence is not a property of things. However, I don't think that the Kantian objection does much work here in my argument because, again, when I talk about pure actuality, I'm not talking about an individual being that has the property of being purely actual. That's not, for example, what Thomists mean when they talk about pure actuality or when they talk about subsistent being itself or any of these other notions. There isn't really a way of restating the point. We're just talking about pure actuality, right? So, for example, this cup is actual, but it's not purely actual because its existence consists in these various things being united. And these things don't have an essential connection to each other. Other things could have this shape. Other things could be made of glass. Other things are particular in addition. So all these things that go into and construct the glass have no essential connection to each other. They're not necessarily connected. They're not like intrinsically pointed at each other. So their actual unity in the glass is an accomplishment. It's an actualization of a potential that exists in them. But when we talk about something that's purely actual, we just mean pure actuality, just pure being. We don't mean a being that has various qualities. We mean pure being. So effectively, I mean, if you wanted to take this as a restatement of my argument, you could say, for example, that it's not consistently thinkable that pure being is not. And so therefore it's not possible. And so therefore necessarily pure being is. I think effectively what I'm doing in response to this Kantian objection, I'm suggesting that with our language, we can talk about pure being and not only beings, not only individual things, but pure being, right? This is the phenomenological, ontological question. This is what Heidegger is talking about. What is being, right? Heidegger talks about this distinction between being and beings, things that exist and existence itself. So my suggestion is that with our language, we can refer to and think about being itself. And we cannot say consistently that being itself or subsistent being is not. So that's kind of the basis of my argument. Now, with respect to your point about concepts, I don't think that we actually need concepts to make sense of the sort of the self-awareness of reason or the self-consciousness of reason. All we need are words by which particular aspects of things can become clearer to us. So, for example, I don't think that I need a concept of a cat in order to understand that, that there are cats. All that I need is a word and somebody to teach me that this word refers to that. The word cat refers to that creature over there. So once I have a word, I am able to use that word to refer and to isolate an item in my consciousness without the need of a concept. I don't need a concept about cats. And I think, in fact, that if I introduce this idea about concepts, it just makes things difficult because then really what I have access to are a bunch of concepts and I don't know whether those concepts refer to anything. So I think that if you do admit concepts or mental representations or any other sorts of like mediating items between consciousness and the world, then you run into a skeptical problem where you don't know that your concepts are adequate. You don't know that your concepts, you don't know that your concepts are true to things because you can never simply perceive the thing itself and make the judgment and the comparison between the concept and the thing. If you always perceive through a concept or through a mediating representation or something like that, then you can never see the thing itself, and you can never know whether your perception is true. So that's how I would respond to this idea about concepts. I would say that concepts do more harm than good. Concepts can be replaced by language and just this notion of the direct reference of words. I don't need a concept to refer to anything. I just need a word and somebody to teach me how that word refers to something.
Awesome. So I think this is the perfect place for me to get into Hegel now. So
now here
Hegel's
you're the
view,
expert. I haven't read any Hegel, so I'm listening.
I would
to
not
you,
say
for you to
expert.
teach me.
I'm not that bold. But now Hegel's view is often characterized as a form of absolute idealism. And so what on earth does that mean? And so to give it a rough characterization, the view that Stephen mentioned a skeptical worry with our concepts. You know, if we're mediating the world from this concept, you know, then there's a skeptical worry of how can we know things in and of themselves? How can we know the world in itself? How do we know these concepts refer to things? And so we're on the Kantian view, we're left with this kind of mysterious thing in itself, this part of the world, the noumena, that we just can't really say anything about. Well, with absolute idealism, we try to solve that problem. And so on this view, we can have knowledge of the world in and for itself by understanding any determinate concept in itself and then out of itself by way of negation. This dialectic implies that humans are rational animals capable of reason and understanding reasons, to have certain beliefs by way of concrete, by the way of concepts and ideas, because the world itself has a rational structure. So now this last part is really important, because it's saying that there is the very world itself. So we divided our world up into the selves and then a world independent of us. Well, absolute idealism also wants to say that world independent of ourselves has ideas built into them too, concepts. And so that when our concepts try to meet the concepts of the world, that's how we can figure out whether they refer to some. So Hegel helps us see this with his famous dictum that the rational is the real and the real is the rational. And what this means is that the metaphysics of reality can be understood by the rational capacities of our minds. How is that possible? It's because the universe, the whole, the rational whole that is the world, gives rise to our individual concepts. It is precisely because we have access to concepts that we can understand the world in and of itself. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we get these concepts? So Kant thought this whole picture was very static. He thought that we had to bring things like concepts of space and time and causation just to interpret our experience, that we just had to have these concepts. Well, Hegel thinks it's much more dynamic than this. He thinks that no, we get our concepts from language. The way that the world works is that our language builds our concepts, and our concepts build our understanding of the world. And so by the evolution of our language over time, the concepts that we interpret the world with have changed over time as well. And so this is the historical aspect of Hegel. He sees history as the unfolding dynamic process of our ideas over time and how they've manifested themselves in the world and how they've helped us to get a greater understanding of the world. So these are both the Kantian argument and this Hegelian argument for absolute idealism are transcendental arguments. This is why I mentioned it earlier. Are you sure this argument is not a transcendental argument? Because the Hegelian Kantian argument that I'm putting forward here is most certainly a transcendental argument, because it's saying that, look, here are the experiences that we all have. here is the things that we know must be the case. And if that's the case, then this is just how the world has to be. Now I realize that you're not too familiar with Hegel yet, but you seem to have more familiarity with Kant. But so the idea here being that we have to interpret our experience through the use of concepts, and those concepts are when you say I need someone to teach me the word, and then how it applies to the world, that how it applies, that's the concept. I think that's the part that's missing from your view. How would you push back on that? And you can stay within the Kantian perspective too, if that makes things easier.
Well, I mean, I would push back. I would say that I don't really see the necessity of the concept, and I would say that if the concept is there, then it actually complicates things. So you say, for example, that language evolves over time, and because of the evolution of language, there's also an evolution in the understanding of the world.
Because of an understanding, language builds our concepts.
Those
concepts evolve over time. So anyone who's familiar with Hegel will know the thesis, antithesis, synthesis type model. So that's all this is you have this thesis, the determinate idea, and it contains contradictions within it because this concept doesn't match the world somehow. Mm-hmm. And that gives birth to an antithesis or the concept out of itself. And so then to use the jargon, you sublate those two understandings to then get a synthesis or a concept in and for itself that helps us to understand. So to maybe this will help make it clear. So you use the example of a cat earlier. I have 5 cats, so we'll stick with a cat.
5 cats? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I have 5 cats. I have 5 cats and a dog. So I have a zoo.
Literally. Hey, Ben, real quick, I wanted to ask, would you mind, as you continue to explain your point here with Hegel, would you mind explaining for me and for the audience how this relates back to the argument? Because I think myself in particular, I'm kind of getting lost in the weeds here, and like how all of this is relevant. I understand.
Fair enough.
Somewhat the idea that concepts are important for your idea, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you want to say is that what we have when we say something like pure actuality, what that is really is a concept, but that concept may or may not correspond to reality.
Sure. So there is. So if we are to understand pure actuality, on my view, we would have to have some sort of concept to even understand that. And those concepts will be given to us by our language. So Stephen used the example earlier of a cat, and he was like, I just need to know the word cat, and then for someone to teach me how to use it or how to understand that. And I think that's the move, you have a subject, you have another subject, and you have a cat. And then we have a word cat. But how does one person help the other person understand that cat refers to this thing over here? And I think the thing that does that is the concept. And so if you leave that out, there is no way of rationally coming to an understanding of ourselves in relation to this other thing in the world that is also part of the world. Again, we got to think of this as a whole. So we're talking about pure act here, and the Hegelian view is that the whole, there's just this one whole, and we divide it up into subjects and objects. Mm-hmm. And then afterwards, you've got to combine them all together. And when you combine them all together, you're left with a real world with a rational structure. Mm-hmm. That rational structure is the concept. That rational structure gives us the capacity to have concepts. The very ability for us to have concepts is what allows us to understand the world in a way that non-human animals cannot. So if you remove concepts from this world, from this picture, Stephen thinks that adding them to it makes things more complicated. I think taking them away makes things impossible. We can't understand anything.
So it sounds like what you're doing 2 things, seems to me, and maybe Yeah, and maybe I'll leave it to Stephen to comment after I say this. So it sounds like you're doing two things. One of the things you're doing is you're saying concepts are necessary, and then another thing that you're doing is a little bit more interesting. It sounds like what you're saying is that concepts are sort of there's a primacy of concepts. Like we need concepts, not just that they're necessary.
Yes.
But we also they come before.
The very world is rational. Yeah. The world is inherently rational. The reason we can understand the rational structure of the world is because we have that very rational structure within us. We are self-consciousness within that world.
And so this is an argument for concepts, and that is going to be relevant to the argument.
That's the argument for absolute idealism. So there's the Kantian argument that concepts are necessary to interpret experience. And then there's the Hegelian argument that concepts are part of the world, the very world itself. And so I want to challenge this, I believe it was the second presupposition that Steve put up there, that we just can't have these concepts, that we can understand the world. It's the presuppositions, not the presuppositions that we had. So it's this number 2. So when he says that the intentionality of consciousness means that thought is in immediate contact with its object, I don't think that's the case. I would insist that no, the intentionality of our consciousness is mediated between its object by concepts. And the reason we can understand, the reason that our concepts can match up to the world, the way to do away with this thing in itself, or the noumena, this mysterious thing, is to have a rational structure behind the world too, such that as we understand this process of dialectic, this thesis, antithesis, synthesis, we are understanding the world in and for itself.
I think so. Some of what you say is sympathetic to my ears, and some of it is not. So I like this idea.
We'll parse it out.
Yeah. I like this idea that the real is rational. I agree that the world itself is rational and corresponds to our structures of understanding it, assuming that we understand it correctly, of course. So I would say that how to put it. I would say that the world is intelligible. So I would say that the world is intrinsically intelligible, right? In contradistinction to Kant. Kant thought that the intelligibility of the phenomenal world was a result of the transcendental categories of consciousness, right? The world was not simply like by default intelligible to us. Consciousness imposes these categories and it creates the phenomenal world, and we understand that. But the world in itself, apart from the categories of our consciousness, is inaccessible to us, and we don't know what that is. So I disagree with him there. I don't think that the categories of consciousness are like these transcendentals that necessarily distort the object. I would go in a different direction. I would say rather that the world, qua intelligible, imposes itself upon us in our consciousness and gives us the categories by which to understand it. So you may agree with this, perhaps, as a Hegelian.
Yeah. It seems like we depart from Kant pretty much at the same point.
Right.
Where you're just left with these things in themselves, this noumena, this kind of mysterious stuff that we just cannot know, that we just can't know. Yes, I depart. And so when you say that the world imparts itself onto our minds, yeah, so the rational is the real is the rational. What we're trying to do is get our concepts to match the rational structure of the world. We want the metaphysics of reality to match with the rational capacities of our mind, such that we've then done away with the distinction between knowing and being. They're the same thing. So in philosophy, we famously divide the world up into metaphysics and into epistemology. Well, if there's only one world, we have to somehow unify those two things. And I think Hegel's project, the rational is the real is the rational, is unifying those two things.
So I agree with you about this philosophical goal of finding the unity of things, right? So I agree with you entirely about that. Where I would disagree is I don't think that concepts help any. I don't think, for example, that I need concepts and I need to somehow match my concepts to the world. What you are calling concepts, I would sooner refer to as modes of intending. So, for example, I can be confronted with an object and I can intend it in a way that doesn't correspond with what that object is. So I can intend things falsely. I can form a false judgment about things. For example, I can be walking through my apartment at night and I can hear a noise in the corner. And when I look, I see something, and then I, spontaneously form the judgment there's a person in the room. Now, in fact, there is no person, right? It was just my cat, moving around in the dark. So I had a mistaken judgment. The way that I intended that object, namely by judging that it was a person, did not correspond with that object itself, like its true content. Because it's actually a cat, not a person. But I don't need concepts for any of this. I just need intending consciousness and a pre-given object. I just need, for example, and also, this is the point that Husserl makes, the pre-given object has to be such that it can become clear to me, like it's intrinsically intelligible, and this intelligibility that belongs to the object is such that it can become clear to me, so that my judgment can conform with it, right? So, I judge that it's a cat. Right? Or excuse me, I judge that it's a human being. It turns out that it's my cat. But it's not as if my cat is permanently hidden from me. I can turn on the lights and see that it's a cat, right? And then I can form the appropriate judgment in response to this change in the conditions of appearance. So I don't need concepts for any of this. I need a pre-given object, and I need a mode of intending consciousness, a judgment. And furthermore, this object has to be such that it can appear to me with such clarity that my judgment can conform to its appearance. This thing can appear to me as a cat, and I can form the corresponding judgment that it is a cat. But I don't need a concept for any of that. All I need is a direct relation to this object, which I have simply, in virtue of consciousness. So I would try to suggest that, like, this point about concepts, I really think they're unnecessary. I think what you need is a pre-given individual object that can become evident to me in such a way that I can form the right judgment about it. I don't need a concept for any of this. I just need an object that can become clear to me, that can manifest itself to me in such a way that I can form the right judgment about it. On the other hand, right, so I'm going to insist on Sokolowski's argument. So this is the argument that Sokolowski makes in Introduction to Phenomenology and in Phenomenology of the Human Person. If you think that consciousness is necessarily mediated by representations or concepts or whatever, just like they had the way of ideas in, British empiricism, like David Hume says, or like Locke and Berkeley say, what we perceive are ideas and not, immediately the object itself. So if you have like these mediating things that are the true objects of consciousness, the problem is you can never know whether this representation corresponds with the object, because in order to make a comparison, you have to be directly, intentionally aware of the object. I have to be able to compare my concept of the object with the object itself. And that implies that I can have a direct intentional relation to the object such that I can make the comparison, right? So adding this concept, adding this idea of concepts doesn't help any. If all of my consciousness is mediated through concepts, then I can never see that my concepts are adequate. You see what I'm saying? Because in order to see that the concept is adequate, I need to be capable of standing in a direct relation to the object to which the concept supposedly refers.
So you use the word adequate.
Yeah.
So, or correct, or valid, that your judgment or thought is adequate, correct,
yeah,
valid. So the objectivity, we would both agree that thought is objective, that we can have thoughts of things that are independent of us.
Yeah.
So when I make a judgment, I am making a judgment that if it were true, it would be objectively true. So the objectivity of thought contains within it the very judgment that the judgment you're making is right or valid or correct. That's a concept. The idea of something being right, we couldn't make any judgment at all unless we, in the way that you're saying, that unless we had this concept of adequacy, correctness, validness. Basically, what I'm saying is that we have to have this concept of considerations that count in favor of things being correct or incorrect, right or wrong, adequate or inadequate. And so just like we have to import the concepts of space and time into our experiences, I think we also have to import the concepts of things like validity and correctness and adequacy into our very judgments. So if every judgment contains within it the very judgment that this judgment is correct, it seems to me that it's inescapable. we have to have concepts when we make judgments. We have to understand those, our experience of the world through concepts. That's where I would want to push back.
Mm. So this discussion is fascinating, and I think that it can go on.
Oh yeah, we're supposed to. There's a question and answering section.
Yeah. But let me ask this question.
Oops.
Okay, so suppose that
I was going to say that we've got about 15 minutes before we get to some Q&A, but we have plenty of time to continue the conversation. So feel free. I mean, I'm enjoying just sitting back and listening.
So let me ask this question. Okay, suppose that I grant your point about concepts, hypothetically for the moment. Which premise of the argument do you think is false as a result?
It would have to be the first one, correct? Because I've already conceded that the contradictions are a sufficient condition for impossibility.
Mm-hmm.
How would I deny 2, 3, and 4? Because those are just inferences, right? Those 2, 3, and 4 follow from that presupposition. So assuming that your second presupposition is what is the justification for one, mm-hmm. That's certainly, I think, the area where I would be putting pressure on. I don't want to say attacking. That's not right.
Yeah. So let's take that premise. It's not consistently thinkable that pure actuality is not actual, right? So in my interpretation of that premise, what I'm doing when I think pure actuality is not actual, I am entering into an intentional relation with pure actuality, and I am denying of pure actuality some thing, namely actuality, which belongs to it by definition. So how would you reinterpret this idea then? How would you reinterpret the situation?
That's a very good question. And so that's probably where not being familiar with your work beforehand is going to be a disadvantage. So it might be something I have to work with a little bit after this as well. So you are saying that pure actuality is the thing that your intentionality is coming in direct contact with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a difficult time even making sense of this claim without what I would refer to as a concept of actuality, a concept of pureness, a concept of the conjunction of those two words into its own concept, and a concept of intentionality, and a concept of a relation to this intentionality. When you say that you come directly in contact with pure actuality, I don't know how to make sense of that without a concept.
So I would say, here's how I would respond. Okay, when I say, for example, pure actuality is not actual, I do not think that sentence can be restated in the following form. The concept pure actuality does not refer to any actual being, or the concept pure actuality does not have any actual instances. I don't think those are restatements. I think those are two different propositions. They mean different things. So my point is that the proposition about the thing is prior to and more basic than the proposition about the concept. So let's take, for example, this way of thinking. Okay, the concept cat has instances, all right? In my view, that's a proposition about a cat, and that proposition is true only because in a prior way, it would be true to say this cat exists. So the truth about the individual is prior to the truth about the concept. The statement about the concept can be true because the statement about the individual is true. And that is impossible unless the statement about the individual cannot be retranslated into a statement about a concept, right? So unless I can say this cat exists.
But why can't we put it in terms of something like a property? So we could say having the property of being purely actual. And we could just say that property is not instantiated.
Well, I don't think there is any such property. I don't think pure actuality is a property. I think...
Well, so any true claim about a thing we can rephrase as a claim about this thing's property. So if the world or if being has the property of pure actualization, we could say, then you can say that pure act and being are the same thing, are identical,
mm-hmm.
right?
Well, if you recall, existence is not a predicate, according to Kant, right? So when we talk about existence, we're not talking about a property of things. Existence is not like the redness of a book or, the roundness of a glass
But what
of
about
water.
pure existence?
Well, I don't think there's any difference. I mean, pure existence is existence. It's pure existence is okay. So we can distinguish, for example, between pure actuality and participated actuality. So I think, for example, that there is an actuality that is proper to me that is not the same thing as pure actuality. My actuality is not the same thing as pure actuality. I'm not talking about the same thing, so to speak. My actuality belongs to me. It's somehow particular to me. It's that in virtue of which I exist. And my actuality can disappear. I cease to be actual, whereas your actuality is not affected by this. You are still actual, and pure actuality itself is not affected by this, right? So my actuality is what you might call a participated actuality. It's particular to me in some weird way,
Yeah.
in some mysterious way. But that's not what I'm talking about. Participated actuality is sort of like the derivative concept, right? The notion of a participated anything is derivative on the notion of a pure whatever or an unparticipated whatever. So this argument has in mind unparticipated pure actuality. That's what I'm talking about. So again, I would say that pure actuality is not a property. I mean, maybe in some extremely loose sense, participated actuality is a property because it's predicated of an individual, right? Like I am actual. What I'm referring to is I'm saying that I have participated actuality, but pure actuality is not a property. It doesn't enter into the concept of anything. It doesn't, belong to anything. It's just pure actuality.
So, the reason I bring up this point for listeners to help tie this back in, Alvin Plantinga has a modal ontological argument, and so why is this argument even relevant? And it's widely thought it's because it can avoid Kant's famous "existence is not a predicate" objection, because even though we can concede that existence is not a predicate, perhaps necessary existence is.
Mm-hmm.
And so that the claim, we couldn't say that existence is a great-making property because existence isn't a predicate, but we could say that necessary existence is a great-making property because necessary existence is a property. And so this is just a similar move here in that you might be able to say, actuality isn't a predicate because it's not a property of things.
Mm-hmm.
But what about pure actuality? Why is that not a predicate or a property of things?
Yeah.
That's why I mentioned that. Would you also think that Plantinga's argument doesn't avoid the Kant's objection?
Well, I think Plantinga's argument is bad for a number of reasons. I think it should be obvious. I'm not dealing with the same concept of God that he is, right? To use the word concept. I'm not talking about God in exactly the same way that he is.
I got you.
Yeah, you got me. Yeah. Old habits die hard.
I know, right? It's the inner analytic in you.
Exactly. Yeah, I have to exercise it every day. I struggle against myself. So I'm not talking about God as if he were a being that it had various properties. And I also am not. I also do not think that necessary existence is a property. I don't think there is any such thing as necessary existence, at least not in the sense that he is talking about. I think that there is pure actuality and there's participated actuality. Participated actuality is what I have, in virtue of which I, as a particular, am actual. Right? My participated actuality is somehow particular to me, and it's conjoined with me. And it's that in virtue of which I can actually do anything. For example, actually talk to you, actually talk to Cameron, and so on. But pure actuality is not a property. Here's an argument for why it's not a property. A property is something that can enter into the content of a thing. And pure actuality cannot enter into the content of anything, because if it does enter into the content of anything, that involves an actualization of a potentiality for it, right? I mean, just like, for example, like blueness. Blueness enters into the content of my shirt. My shirt is blue, other things are also blue. So blueness is unconnected to my shirt or to any other blue thing. That means that when blue does enter into the content of my shirt, that's an actualization of a potentiality. That's something that is true of blue that did not have to be true, right? So something explains that. Whereas pure actuality is just pure actuality. It doesn't have a potentiality. It doesn't have a possibility of entering into the composition of something or anything like that. So we're talking about something that's not a property. It's not an intelligible content. It's not like a part of the definition of something. Pure actuality is pure actuality. So we can't use these other categories for understanding it and for trying to like subsume it under some other category like that of property or anything like that.
Gotcha. So I think we've got about 5 more minutes before Q&A. So I'll just leave the last 2 worries I had on my list. So are simple. So this argument, the conclusion is to pure act. Is this something that can respond to our religious concerns? Do you think that this argument, the conclusion of it, if accepted in full, has theological value? Mm-hmm. And then the second worry would just be, this argument presupposes the Aristotelian metaphysics of act and potency. Is that so? I know that you said this argument isn't necessarily the hill you're prepared to die on yet, but is the Aristotelian metaphysics that underlies it a hill that you would be willing to die on? So I think we could probably close it up with those 2 pieces.
So in response to your first question, can this notion of pure actuality correspond to the religious aspirations of the human being or something like that? I mean, in the abstract, I don't know. But I do think, for example, that it's possible to be religious and to believe in pure actuality. Right. So suppose that you have abandoned any notion of God as a maximally perfect being or anything like that. Right. You've taken up the austere, task of pure atheism, and you're learning to think of God strictly as pure actuality, that is the basis of all being, and that, you can't say anything else really about him. You can't really understand him, and so on and so forth. Could you later on in life nevertheless develop something like religion in relation to pure actuality? I think so. Because you are still going to be confronted in your life with things that, you can respond to by means of a religious attitude. You can, for example, one day just be very, it dawns upon you that your existence is a contingency. It didn't have to happen. There's nothing about you that demands that you exist. And yet you do exist as a result of pure actuality, as a result of this, pure actuality that sustains you in existence. And you feel so happy about that because existence is a good thing, right? Your existence is that in virtue of which you can enjoy everything that is out here to enjoy. And so therefore you can adopt an attitude of gratitude to pure actuality. You can become grateful and you can say, thank you, God, for creating me. Alternatively, you can live your life and be confronted with problems. And, something happens to you, you're put in a bind somehow. And then you stop and think for a moment and you say, well, hold on a sec. All this world exists only because God sustains it in existence at every moment, right? This world is sort of at the mercy of his power. So why shouldn't I ask God to help me? Now, I don't know how it's going to work out exactly. I mean, it's not as if pure actuality has ears and he can hear me and he thinks, oh, Stephen is praying, I'd better respond to him. And then he does something. It's not like that. Obviously, the story is not going to be like that. But you might think that it's nevertheless a reasonable thing to do to pray. In your act of desperation, you cry out to the Lord, even though you don't know how it is, the fact, actually that your prayer will be effective or whether it'll be answered, you might still do it. And if your prayer is answered, then you might say, oh, God saved me. I prayed to God and he saved me. This is what happened. So I do think it's possible to adopt religious attitudes towards pure actuality, even though at first this notion of pure actuality seems religiously extremely dry, right? And overly apophatic, it seems like it has no content. It's nevertheless possible to become religious because the circumstances of life demand it. The circumstances, or they don't demand it, but the circumstances of life sort of motivate the adoption of religious attitudes, in light of the fact that my life in this world is like this, and it's a result of God that the world is like this, and so therefore I relate to him in whatever way. Your second question was, what was the second question again?
It's the underlying metaphysics of Aristotle. So we don't find concepts like act and potency in the physical sciences, for example. So we have to adopt an earlier, some would say, archaic metaphysics in order to make this argument work. Are you willing to die on the Aristotelian metaphysics? Is that something that worries you, or?
Well, I mean, I don't know the extent to which act and potency do not enter into contemporary science. I'm not an expert here by any means, but there are some persons who interpret some of the language used in quantum mechanics and so on in these categories of actuality and potentiality. I also don't think that anything about contemporary science demands, demands that you give up the concept of potentiality or the concept of possibility in addition to actuality. But I also just think like these things are phenomenologically given. I would give a phenomenological argument. This cup is an object of my experience. I don't know that it's actual, but neither is it nothing. So therefore, being neither nothing nor guaranteed to be actual, it's therefore a possibility. So I can gain this idea of the possibility, and that's what I would say, in fact, that this cup, considered in itself, is a possibility of existence. It's a possible rather than an actual thing. It might, in fact, also be actual, but prior to its being actual, it has to be a possible
concept.
How would you say?
I said, would you say concept?
No, not a concept. No.
I know, I'm just messing with you.
Is a possible. So, I think
that puts us at an hour and 30 minutes, though.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, Cameron, I didn't know if you wanted to go into the next section or not. That was a really good discussion. I had a lot of fun doing this.
Yeah. So here's what I'm thinking. First, what I'd like to do is offer an objection to Stephen myself of this argument, at least one of the things that he said earlier. And I'm going to see if I can do it, because I'm trying to remember what he said off the top of my head, and I think I've got a clear understanding of it. So I'll just give it to you, get your thoughts, and then we'll move to some Q&A. So we have some Q&A in the live chat already. I'm noticing them as they populate. So if you have a question for either Stephen or Ben, let me know in the live chat, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. But Stephen, here is my objection. So earlier, in response to the parity objection, what you were saying is you were making a distinction between thisness and suchness. And what I take that distinction to be is basically an individual in their nature or their essence. Is that correct?
It's not exactly correct, but it's close. I would say that an individual being is a this such, and a this such is a composite of thisness and suchness. Thisness is that in virtue of which the being is a particular. It's its individuating principle. It's the individualness, whatever you want to call it. The suchness, on the other hand, is all of the qualities that the thing has that can be known about it, whether it's its essential properties or its accidental properties or whatever. So, for example, felinity is a part of the suchness of my cat, like the essence of catness, for example. That's a part of the suchness of my cat. But also the fact that she's asleep. She's not essentially asleep, but she is actually right now contingently asleep. So this being asleep is a part of the suchness of my cat in addition to her felinity. So I would say.
Okay, so suchness would include essential and contingent properties. Sorry, I'm like rubbing my eye because I feel like I got something in there. Yeah. So so your next step was to say, well, anything a pure actuality can't be a combination of can't be a this such, because every this such is every actual this such, I suppose, was made actual. It was potential at one point and then it became actual. Something along those lines. Is that correct?
Well, I would put it like this: the unity of the this such is an actualization of a potentiality that exists in its two principles. So thisness stands in potentiality relative to suchness and vice versa. And this is how I think about this, right? For example, thisness is just pure individuation. It just individuates. That's what it does. And so because it just individuates, it doesn't matter what kind of suchness it individuates. You can have an individual cat, an individual dog, an individual human, right? So thisness by itself is indifferent to suchness, but it stands in a potentiality towards suchness. It can individuate any suchness. And so also suchness is indifferent or in potentiality to thisness, right? There are actual cats, but there don't have to be cats. Cats don't exist by as a necessary fact, and suchness by itself is indifferent to any particular this such. Felinity is indifferent to whatever cats exist, right? Particular cats exist, but felinity is indifferent to what cats exist. None of these cats could presently exist, and felinity itself would remain unaffected. So that's why I say, for example, that the this such is an actualization of a potentiality. There's a potential in suchness to be individuated, and there is a potential in thisness to individuate any suchness, right? So the unity of those two is an actualization.
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to use some different terminology, bring it in here in a complex to make things more complex than they already are. Is I'm going to use the concept of a brute fact, and so you could have this is the objection. You could have a being, say a being that is pure actuality, that is a this such, and there just is no explanation why it is a this such. Because what you want to say is that every this such has an explanation why it's actual. Is that right? So you could have a this such, i.e. pure actuality, that just has no explanation. I think that's what William Lane Craig and other people would want to say about God, is that God is a this such, but he just has no outside explanation of his existence.
Right.
So what's your objection to that?
I think that's crazy. I don't think there's I don't think that sort of thing is possible. And my friend on Facebook, Daniel Vecchio, recently talked about this. He said brute necessary existence, right? This idea about brute necessary existence. An object that has the property of existing necessarily, even though nothing about that object really demands that it exists necessarily. I think that this is just sort of nonsensical. I don't think that there is any such thing as a necessary this such. I think this suchness is basically what it is to be a contingent object. Every contingent
so I think there's one
is
option. I think there is one option, and that would be a perfect being. A perfect being would explain why it would be necessary, even though it wouldn't have some sort of outside explanation. But that would get us into some other territory that we may not want to get into at this point in the discussion. So I'll let you decide if you want to respond to that, and then we'll move to Q&A.
Yeah. So basically, what I would say is I don't admit the possibility of brute facts. I think that everything that is a certain way and cannot explain itself being that way is explained in terms of something else. And I do not think, for example, and I don't believe in anything like brute necessary existence. I don't believe in a necessary this such or anything like that. I think that the only
I think a brute fact is necessary.
Yeah,
you've got to have a brute fact.
I suppose I disagree with you. I suppose I would disagree with you there.
I bet Ben would agree with me, though. So Ben and I are going to team up, and we're going to beat you up. All right. So here's all right. Let's get to. So I haven't actually pulled the screen up before, so here we go. It looks like it's going to work. All right. So here is the first question from 20 Faces. He says, "Capturing Christianity, isn't knowledge of the nature of the object necessary to come into direct intentional contact with it? Since we can't know the nature of God, isn't this a problem?" I guess this is directed at Stephen.
Yeah, I don't think that that's true because, for example, the nature of something is something that we learn, and we learn the nature of something through repeated experience with it. We don't know, for example, what the nature of cats are. We're not simply born knowing what the nature of cats are. We're not born knowing what the nature of human beings are. Some people still don't know what the nature of a human being is because they never even asked themselves the question. And yet they regularly come into intentional, relations with human beings. You don't need to know the nature of a thing in order for it to be given to consciousness. The givenness of the thing to consciousness is the precondition of the knowledge of its nature. So I will make this point. Husserl says this in Experience and Judgment. He says that the precondition of the formation of a judgment is the pre-givenness of the object. So, for example, if there's not an object first given to your consciousness, then you cannot form a judgment about it, right? Your judgment is sort of aimed at that object. The cat is on the sofa. Cameron is talking to me. Ben is a smart person. Whatever. So the judgment is aimed at the object.
That last one wasn't true.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to be the one to say it, but and for me to even form the judgment, I have to have the object pre-given. Now, of course, in phenomenology, knowledge consists in judgments. When I know something, I make a judgment. So, for example, I can know the nature of a human being when I make the judgment that the human being is essentially a rational animal, right? That's a judgment that I make. But in order to make the judgment, the object has to be pre-given to me. So the givenness of the object to consciousness is a precondition of the formation of any judgment and therefore of any knowledge of that object. And I don't need to know the object in order for me to enter into kind of an intentional relation to it. And you can also consider this. There are things that we encounter in our experience, whether in terms of science or religiously or whatever, but that are mysterious to us. We don't know what they are yet. From the fact that we don't know what they are, it doesn't mean that we're not encountering them. It just means that the encounter is not perfectly clear. So again, encountering is a form of intentional relation. It's a way of experiencing something. So you do not need to know what a thing is in order to enter into an intentional relation with it. You can encounter a thing apart from knowing what it is.
Ben, I'm going to ask real quick that you center yourself up in your screen because you're kind of like falling off the edge here. It looks like he's actually frozen. So I'm just going to ask the next question. There you go. It looks like this one is still directed at Stephen. Okay, I'll just get to it. He says, I don't understand the difference between necessary being and pure actuality. How is pure actuality not a predicate and being a predicate? Is not a predicate and being a predicate. Yep.
Necessary being. Okay, so let's just talk about necessary being. What is a necessary being? A necessary being is one that exists in every possible world. Okay, let's take that definition for a necessary being. Of course, there's an ambiguity here. Are we talking about a necessary thing, or are we talking about necessary existence? Because those are not exactly the same thing, but it doesn't matter. A necessary being is something that exists in every possible world. Okay, Thomas Aquinas talks about necessary things, necessary beings, which are necessary in virtue of themselves or in virtue of another. Something can be necessary while it's not necessary in virtue of itself. It's necessary in virtue of something else. And here's an example that should be familiar to people with a background in analytic philosophy. The set containing the number 2 exists necessarily, okay? But the necessity of that set is derivative on the prior necessity of the number 2 itself, right? So the set containing an object is derivative on the existence of the objects which are contained in the set. So the set containing the number 2 can be necessary, but it doesn't have its necessity of itself. It has a kind of a derived necessity, namely it's derived from the necessity of the number 2 itself, assuming that you agree that the number 2, exists necessarily. So you can be necessary and not be necessary by yourself, right? But with the notion of pure actuality, when we're talking about pure actuality, we're talking about subsistent being. We're talking about something that could not fail to exist, obviously, but also that does not exist in virtue of anything else, that exists simply on its own. So a necessary being and pure actuality are not exactly the same thing. I would say furthermore that pure actuality is not a being. I would say pure actuality is subsistent being itself, but I would not say that it is a being. Like God is not a being. He's not one thing among all the things that exist. God is pure actuality, and there is no other phrase that captures the idea more adequately than that. He is not a being, but he is pure actuality. So I would also say that.
Ben, any thoughts?
No, not really. I was taking all that in as best I could. I thought it was a very good question.
All right, here we go. Here's the next question from Iman Sergini. Why does Nemes look like the atheist out of the two?
He just thinks that I must be an atheist because I'm a Seahawks fan, as if all Seahawks fans have to be, godless, lefty, liberal, commies, Chad, whatever from Seattle. That's not true. I'm a Seahawks fan. I live in, good old Arizona. I'm a cowboy from the Southwest, but I just happen to be a Seahawks fan.
Maybe he thinks that Ben looks like a youth pastor, which he kind of does.
He really does.
Let's be honest.
Ben, you're missing
out. I think it might just be more I look more like a theist than Stephen looks like an atheist. That might be the case.
All right,
Ben,
here's
really
another
out on this opportunity to be a youth pastor. You would fit right in. I think you'd be perfect. You like Zelda. You have a bunch of cats. It's exactly the job for you.
I've got
bunch
gauged
of cats.
ears.
You got gauged ears.
Gauged ears. Yes. All right, here's a question from Scott Ferguson. How is pure actuality not a small step to logos? Do you know what this means?
I think I have an idea.
Because I don't.
Yeah. So, in, for example, like Eastern Orthodox theology, there is this notion of the logos. The logos, of course, refers to the Son, in the Trinity. In beginning was the Word, right? The Greek word there is o logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and so on. So this is a reference to the logos, which in Maximus the Confessor is basically like mind or nous in Plotinus, if you're familiar with the philosophy of Plotinus. So in Maximus the Confessor, there's a distinction between the logos and the logoi. And the logoi are like the individual essences of things. So, for example, there's a logos with a small lambda of humanity, and you and I, for example, all share in the logos of humanity. My cat shares in the logos of felinity, and so on and so forth. And all these logoi, these ideas, these words, right, that refer to the essences of things, exist
Concepts.
in concepts. Yeah, if you insist on using that language, these concepts exist within the logos with a capital lambda, the mind, the divine mind. So basically, it's a form of conceptualism. It's a form of theistic conceptualism, basically. There is the logos, which is the divine mind, which understands the essence of everything whatsoever. And then this logos creates individual beings in accordance with the logoi or logismoi, or whatever they're called in Eastern Orthodox theology, of each individual thing. So basically, he has all these ideas, and he creates individual things in accordance with these ideas. He creates humans in accordance with his idea of humanity. He creates cats in conformity with the idea of felinity, and so on and so forth. I don't think that it's very far. Like, I'm not, for example, when I talk about pure actuality, basically what I'm arguing for is a form of philosophical theism. And what I basically invented the phrase difference principle, and now people have picked it up, and now everybody talks about the difference principle, but I just made it up, right, in a paper that I wrote. So I'm going to make up another term now and hope that it sticks equally. I'm going to talk about pure act theism as a species or a form of classical theism. Basically, what I'm trying to do in this argument is to argue for pure act theism, setting aside the question of the truth of Christianity and whatever else, Christian theologians of various traditions might want to say about God. I'm trying to suggest that pure act theism is true on the basis of this, quasi-Thomistic ontological argument with a phenomenological twist.
I think I muted myself. All right, there we go. I'm good. All right, so Jonathan Talks is the next question here. It says, such as the claim that God could create an infinite number of universes, but how do these sorts of claims about what God could do not introduce potentiality into God? All of these questions are for Stephen. If you have a question for Ben, please leave it in the live chat.
Yeah, ask questions for Ben too. I can't be the only one.
Well, this is Stephen's baby. I totally get it. No, I totally get it. This is your project.
Yeah,
well, Ben's just hanging out now.
I want to see you in the hot seat, start sweating, not knowing how to answer these questions.
There you go.
That only I do.
There you go.
All right, I'll try to find one for the next one.
Yeah. So this is
go ahead, Stephen. Good luck.
How is it right? I mean, this is exactly Ryan Mullen's argument against divine simplicity, right? If God could create another world than this, then how does that not entail that there's a potentiality in God? I will just have to refer this Jonathan Talks to my discussions with Ryan Mullins and also to the paper that I published. You can find it on my academia.edu page. Divine simplicity does not entail modal collapse. Effectively, what Jonathan is saying, okay, if God could create universes other than this one, that means that there must exist in God a potentiality to create this or that universe. If God had created a different universe, there must have been something different about God in that world, right, where he creates that universe, than there is in God this world. This is basically the difference principle. I just talked about it a second ago. The idea is that a possible difference in effect presupposes a possible difference in cause. So that if God creates this world, but he could also have created another world, that's because God himself could have been otherwise. The classical theist has to reject this, and especially the pure act theist has to say, no, this is not true. God creates this world. Another world could have been created, but nothing at all has to be different about God. That's because God's causation is purely indeterministic. God creates this world, but nothing about God necessitates that he creates this world. A different world could have been created, no world could have been created, and God himself would have remained exactly the same. Now, this is very mysterious. It's hard to understand how exactly that's possible, but in just a few moments of being able to talk about it, I can't exactly make the case as convincingly as I could. Basically, what I would say is that if the classical theist wants to affirm the contingency of the created order, he has to deny the difference principle and simply accept this consequence that God creates this world indeterministically, and that no world or some other world could have existed while God remains entirely unchanged.
Well, now that Stephen has conceded the debate, why don't we move to? No, I'm just kidding. So let's at this point, because I still don't have any questions for Ben. Why don't we move to just some overall thoughts about the discussion? I think that might be a really fruitful time. Just take 5 minutes each and thoughts on where the conversation has gone, and then we'll just close it out. So we'll start with Ben. I want to get Ben's thoughts because he hasn't talked in a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we'll go to Stephen, give his
it's also
closing thoughts.
Stephen's project, so yeah, him having the last word.
Yeah, and Ben, it looks like we're having some
really
technical issues with your you're kind of cutting in and out. So hopefully the internet connection will pick back up. I think we'll be able to hear you, but your video's kind of jumping back and forth. It looks better now. Yeah.
Audio.
Now I can't hear him at all.
Cool. Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah, we'll just do audio.
Are you serious? Oh no. Okay.
You're killing me, Ben. Oh my goodness.
We're talking with ghosts.
You're killing me, Smalls. I first want to say that I really enjoyed this discussion. It's not very often these days that I get to talk about Hegel and people are willing to sit there and listen. So I very much enjoyed this. Like I said before, my attitude towards ontological arguments has been criticized very heavily in the past, and so I'd like to change that because my attitude has been that I just don't think that they're a useful piece of natural theology. I don't think that they are good for trying to convince someone who is genuinely indeterminate about the question of God's existence. If they're trying to figure out the answer to the question of God's existence, I don't know if those historical arguments have helped us at all. This argument is much more different, though, in that it takes us much deeper than the concepts of the traditional ontological arguments. But I think that does come at a cost. So it does have to set. So the original ontological arguments have a perfect being, or a greatest possible being, or a maximally great being as its conclusion. But this one is more modest in that it sticks with something that's, pure act. So we're not getting the moral properties from this. We're not getting obligations of worship. But still, I think that this is an interesting argument to help us understand the nature of knowledge just in general. So we had a really good conversation. My favorite part about the conversation was the surrounded concepts. So I thought it was really neat that Stephen's position requires for him to deny concepts almost categorically. That's not true. But the primacy of concepts. Whereas my view wants to insist on the primacy of concepts. So I thought that was a really, really cool point of deep disagreement where we could have a lot of fruitful philosophical conversations. And hopefully they've helped any listeners get inspired to maybe read Husserl or Kant or Hegel. Maybe these ideas, someone heard something that was like, hey, I'd really like to learn more about that. And this is how philosophy works. So I'll turn it over now to Stephen.
First, what I want to say is that I very much appreciate and I'm grateful to both of you, Cameron and Ben, for agreeing to discuss this with me, because this is an argument that I've been thinking about a lot, and I have a draft of a paper written. Like, I eventually intend to send this somewhere for publication, because I think that this is an argument that captures the essence of what the ontological arguments are getting at, but it does so in a way that's atypical, and it does so in a way that is unencumbered by some of what I consider, here I will show my bias, what I consider to be the metaphysical and phenomenological shortcomings of analytic philosophy of religion. So I appreciated the opportunity to come on and to talk about it with both of you. I don't say that I'm committed to this argument as if I will defend it to the death, but at the same time I will say that I do. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that this argument works. I think it's actually a fascinating, different approach to ontological arguments. Effectively, you can think about the argument like this: the argument is trying to show that there is already an implicit awareness of God's existence in us, all of us, right? Simply once we can, by whatever means, attain to the notion of pure actuality, we can see that this thing has to exist, and so therefore that God exists. So I think basically what I'm trying to get at in this argument is to show that like some sort of knowledge of God is implicit in our consciousness. Now this sounds presuppositionalist. I don't want to like take on the entire baggage of presuppositional apologetics and all the other garbage that they have to, that they talk about. I don't care about all that. But I do think that this idea that there is a kind of a fundamental, implicit, perhaps like inexplicit awareness of God in consciousness per se, I think that's interesting, and it's something that I want to develop further. It's an idea that I want to pursue further, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to get to talk about it with you guys. I also thought that the discussion about concepts was great, and if anything, I think that this can motivate people who are interested in apologetics and in ontological arguments, philosophy of religion, to also read more deeply in the history of philosophy, and especially the history of European philosophy, from Kant to Hegel to Husserl to Heidegger, and to familiarize themselves with more than just the contemporary analytic philosophy of religion scene.
It's a very rich tradition.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to say, after I've seen the whole argument and I've heard you defend it, what it sounds like to me is that you're giving a Thomistic phenomenological version of Anselm's argument. That's what it seems like to me. It doesn't seem like you're giving something that's radically different. The modal, because when I think of ontological argument, the first one that I think of is the modal version. It's like possible, God exists, therefore God exists, something along those lines. That's a very simplistic version of it. But the Anselmian version, it was basically just like the greatest conceivable being has to also exist. So something similar to that. And this is almost similar to that. It's like the pure actuality. You can't think of pure actuality without thinking that it's actual, that pure actuality is actual. You can't consistently conceive of that. So it seems to me like there's a lot of similarity between your version and Anselm's version. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there is a similarity, but I think that my version is an improvement, because when Anselm talks about, a being than which none greater can be conceived, or that than which none greater can be conceived, I think the initial interpretation of that in a lot of persons' minds is that God is a this such that has various properties, among which is this property of necessarily existing. I'm trying to prevent that confusion, because I think that confusion is what leads to the parity objection. So I'm trying to prevent that confusion by clearing out this notion of that than which none greater can be conceived, all these axiological and value-laden judgments. Set all that to the side. Talk about pure actuality, right? Pure actuality is something that we cannot think about without also recognizing that it's actual. And I think that's what sort of Anselm is trying to get at. And I think that these other ideas about maximally great being, moral perfection, every perfection, whatever, I think all those things simply confuse the force of the argument, and they send people down a rabbit hole in the wrong direction.
So
I think.
So here's my suggestion. Write a paper called like an updated Anselmian argument, or updated something like that. I think you'd actually get a lot of progress there. Anyways, something to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you guys for coming on. It's been awesome. We'll definitely do something again in the future.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right, let me just go ahead and address the audience real quick. Thank you guys for tuning in and watching this debate. It was more of a discussion, as I think you guys saw. And that's what I intend to do here, is host discussions on really serious and important topics, but in a way that is not combative, is productive. The type of conversation that you saw today was very, very high level, but it was also just friendly and cordial. And that's the kind of thing that I want to promote here. If you find value in that type of thing happening, those types of videos, then why not consider supporting us on Patreon, patreon.com/capturingchristianity. The link to that is actually in the description of the video. And if you sign up today, you can get access to our 12 apologetics courses for beginners. This is the list of all 12 different courses. So if you're just getting into apologetics, we don't have one on the ontological argument, unfortunately, but we have tons of different content on the ontological argument on our YouTube channel, and even in the one that you saw today. But this is the 12 courses that we have: the contingency argument, fine-tuning, Kalam, why apologetics matters is our first course. All 12 of these courses are incredible. And I'm saying that because I didn't teach them. I invited on like the top people in the world to come and teach these courses. They are incredible. So if you want to support this ministry and get access to these 12 courses, then head over to, like I said, patreon.com/capturingchristianity. That's the way to do it. So we have one last thing. The Bereans group is a Facebook group for patrons. So if you sign up on Patreon at any level, you get access to our Facebook group called the Bereans. Bereans? I always mispronounce it. Anyways, they were just suggesting today, someone posted in there in the Facebook group today, that we should do an Among Us. Is that what it's called? It's like a game or something. They were wanting us, like, as a group to start playing some games together. There's a whole lot of really cool things that happen in the Bereans group. So if you want to support this ministry, get all the other stuff that I mentioned. And it's just awesome if you're considering it. Thank you. Another way to support us is just to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on the bell. It's free. You can do it right now if you're interested in this kind of thing. So anyways, thank you for watching. We'll see you guys later. Remember, Christianity's true.